Hello, I'm here with Dr. Micheline van Riemsdijk from Uppsala University, who has joined the Center for Global Cooperation Research as a research fellow from June to October. Now that your fellowship is coming to an end, we would like to talk to you about the research you've conducted here. And Micheline, you're a specialist in the field of migration studies. And migration is currently a highly discussed topic in society and media. But which questions do you, as a researcher, pose upon the issue of migration?
That is a very interesting question. Thanks for asking. I think that we are in a really interesting time right now. So especially in 2015, when we had the so-called refugee crisis, migration again came really high on the agendas of many countries. And so I am very interested in what is happening right now. So in terms of what are good ways to address refugee issues, and especially how do you keep people safe? So when they make crossings and risk their lives, how do you make sure that people can stay safe? So that gets then to the issue of governance. So what is a good governance model? And we have many types of migration, many categories of migration that all have very different dynamics in terms of how migration happens, what migrants are involved, and also how that migration is then being governed in terms of what regulations we have and in terms of how free people are to move. So do you want an example or do you want to go on to the next question?
Maybe I could pose my next question, because this is, you have a focus on the global level of regulations. How would you describe the global approaches to migration governance? Is there a global framework? And what do we see, and which kind of developments can we expect here?
So I would say there is an emerging global governance. So Alexander Betts wrote a book on global governance in 2011, and that's where he was arguing that there was no global governance framework. And now we're only 7 years later, and we start to see the beginnings of that. At the same time, I also should say it didn't start from nowhere. You know, since the 1990s, we have had different initiatives, at least regional and even to some level global initiatives to govern migration. But what is different now, and to get back to that refugee crisis in 2015, is that there was a renewed call and a renewed buy-in from many states that something should be done. And so now we actually have a global compact on migration and another one on refugees, where states actually have set out objectives to improve global governance.
This global compact on migration is at the heart of your research project here at the center. But before we can go into the details on the global compact on migration, could you briefly define and describe this compact, its objectives, at which stage of negotiations we are currently, and could you maybe define its relation to this global compact on refugees?
So in 2016, in September, there was a meeting at the UN, a high-level dialogue, and it was in New York City, and that's where the member states then unanimously adopted the so-called New York Declaration. And so this was a document where the member states then set out for the next 2 years the different stages that were going to happen to then create 2 global compacts, one on migration and the other one on refugees. And so that started then a consultation process. And so for about 1 year, then there were many different consultation sessions with many different stakeholders. And then in July 2018, the member states then approved the final draft, the 4th draft of the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. So that compact is then a state-led process, and that was then approved by the member states, while the Global Compact on Refugees, which only deals with refugees, was then a different process where they then approved the text on refugees.
And you've analyzed in your research project these negotiation processes in regard to the Global Compact on Migration, and going into the details on your research project. Which questions did you ask when analyzing this, and which method did you use?
So since I'm in the Center for Global Cooperation Research here at the University of Duisburg-Essen, I was very interested in global cooperation. And so I started out with the question of how the member states think about and frame international cooperation. And so the United Nations has these websites where they have posted all the videos of all the consultation sessions. And so I selected the one on international cooperation that was held in Geneva in June 2017. And so that's where they got the member states together and several civil society actors that were either invited or that spoke. And so I was very interested in how these actors then frame international cooperation. And that gets me to the method, which is then framing. And so I'm using a framing analysis, and that is where you then identify the actors that are involved in framing a particular issue, how they frame the problem. So what is the key issue that they are studying, and how do they or not studying, but the key issue they are dealing with, and how do they then define that key issue, and then also the solutions that they propose, or maybe, and this is also the more interesting part, the alternate solutions that maybe are outside the regular framing of a particular issue.
So the new thing about this new Global Compact on Migration is that there are new actors in the field who are negotiating?
That is an interesting way of putting it.
Have the right to put their own frames into the discussion, is this right?
So it was billed as the most comprehensive consultation process in history, I guess. So they held thematic sessions, they also held regional consultation sessions, and then they also held consultations with different stakeholders. So it's a very comprehensive process. And so in that sense, many different stakeholders, not just states, but also non-governmental stakeholders, did have a chance to at least participate in the framing of how the Global Compact should be developed. Of course, it's still the states that make the ultimate decision. So the question is, how much input do those stakeholders really have? But yes, they were heard and they were invited to the table.
As some kind of new historical chance to govern migration on a global level, what do you think will remain of this rhetoric? Which kind of instruments will we observe? Will we observe them? Or are those frames that are being discussed, are they just rhetorical commitments without political instruments following them?
That is a really good question, and that is also an issue we have discussed at length here in the center when I was presenting my research. And of course, the easy answer would be time will tell. But it is a very important question to ask. So it was a critical moment in time in 2015 when there was a lot of critical mass and a lot of pushing that something needed to be done. So the question is, of course, are these global compacts then a way to say, see, we did something and then not moving forward, or is it actually something that will make a difference? So there are a few parts to this question then. So one is that the compacts are non-legally binding. So there are 23 objectives that then say how migration ideally should be governed. But if you don't really have any instruments to then enforce that is actually going to happen, it depends very much on the willingness of the member states to actually implement that. At the same time, it does give a vocabulary to talk about international migration and especially the governance of migration. And I went to a meeting at Queen Mary University in London, and they had invited local stakeholders to talk about the implementation of the Global Compact on migration. And so they asked them, how do you see the Global Compact and what will your role be in implementing this? And actually one of those participants then said, well, what is very useful for us is that the Global Compact gives us a vocabulary to talk about this and to start thinking through what instruments we can use to actually implement this on the ground. So in that sense, maybe we shouldn't just look at what is happening globally, but we should actually look at what is going to happen locally with all those stakeholders that actually deal directly with migrants and migration issues locally. Maybe that is more where you see that actual impact.
Okay, so maybe we can hope for positive impact on the local level, new narratives and new grammar about talking about migration. But on a global level, global governance of migration still faces some obstacles, and I guess you have identified some of them in your research. Can you define them?
So one of those key findings that maybe was not so surprising, but was surprising to me in terms of how prevalent this was the concern of national sovereignty. So that states should have the sovereign right to decide on who they admit to their territory, who remains, and who they return from their territory. And so when I analyzed those, the thematic session, many states made this initial statement in their intervention that we want to acknowledge our sovereign right to control access to our territory or something similar. So sovereignty is still one of those key foundations that are very important for states before they even start talking about how they can govern migration internationally and even globally. Another obstacle that I found was more in general the institutional obstacles. So in terms of how are you actually going to make this happen? And then the third one was at what level should migration really be governed? So we talk about global governance, and these are the global compacts on migration. But when you look at how international cooperation is actually being discussed, especially in this thematic session, but also in the documents like the New York Declaration and the Global Compact on Migration, it is very much actually at lower levels of governance. So it is bilateral agreements, it is regional agreements. So the regional consultative processes, for example, were often mentioned as good fora to discuss migration issues. So when you start talking about global cooperation, there's actually much less of that.
I guess many stakeholders do have this position, that they prefer regional or bilateral cooperation. But which arguments would you bring into the discussion when talking about global cooperation on migration? Why do we need global cooperation here?
Well, first of all, I'm not so sure we do. So having listened to these debates several times, actually many times in the thematic session, it does make sense. So migration flows are mostly international, regional. Of course, we have a global number of migrants that move, but most of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of security, in terms of keeping people safe, that is very much at a lower scale. So in that sense, I think it's okay to keep it as business as usual. But on the other hand, for example, it was also very clear that human rights are being reinforced, that many states said, we really should make sure that we value the human rights of all migrants, no matter their status. And that is really a key issue. So if you can achieve that at the global level, if you can at least keep everybody safe, I think that part is really key. And I hope that the global compacts will do more about that.
Okay. So maybe we are moving from a regime of regulations on the national levels to a regime of norms on the global level, while still having implementation on the local or on the regional level? What do you think?
I like how you summed that up.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that is right. I think that the global compacts really helped reinforce those norms. It's not like we invented them, recently, but I think it was a good exercise to discuss what those key norms are and also get more buy-in from the states and also from other stakeholders. So in that sense, I think having that global commitment to that and then at the same time implementing that at lower levels of decision making, I think would be really good.